And again, thank you to those attendees who are just joining us. We will start the webinar in just a moment, but appreciate you all being here. Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to go and start the recording and we will get going. Thank you everyone for joining us for this free webinar, Navigating NEPA in Trail Development. My name is Candace Gallagher and I am the Director of Operations and Webinar Coordinator for American Trails. This is our 269th webinar in the American Trails Advancing Trails webinar series, and this is the third of 3 webinars in a series that we are hosting have hosted this fall and winter in partnership with the Professional Trail Builders Association. Some logistics that this webinar is being recorded. It includes real-time closed captioning in English and also offers free learning credits. And you will see a link to the quiz and the survey in the chat box. And you can turn on captions by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And if another language is ever needed, please just let us know. And attendees will receive a follow-up email from me within 2 days that will include a link to the recording, the transcript, a resources slide that will include the presenter's email, as well as learning credit details. And I want to thank our additional webinar partners today that include iZone Imaging, the Grisberger Fund, 5280 Creative, the Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service, the USDA Forest, as well as the Grisberger Fund. And the Grisberger Fund is a donor-advised fund that belongs to 2 regular working people who really love trails, and they encourage everyone to learn more about donor-advised funds and how to increase support for American trails and the free education that we provide. I'm happy to introduce our presenter for today. We have Scott Linenberger, who is the principal with K-Lin Enterprises. But before I pass it off to Scott, I'm going to hand it over to Erin Kay, who's the Executive Director of the Professional Trail Builders Association.
Thanks, Candace. I'm Erin Kay, the Executive Director of the Professional Trail Builders Association, and we're excited to offer the third in this season's series of PTBA webinars, Navigating NEPA. Just a little bit about PTBA. So we're the trade industry for the trails, or the trade association for the trail industry. And we work to advance the trail industry by promoting quality and professionalism. We represent private sector companies who specialize in trail design, planning, and construction. And before becoming a PTBA member, every single company is professionally vetted through a portfolio submission and a peer review process. And right now we have a worldwide network and we're growing more and more, especially in Australia and Europe. I just wanted to share a little bit about our kind of impact on the ground, of our member companies. This is our 2023 data. We're still collecting the 2024, but more than 1,500 miles of trail were built, designed more than 2,700 miles of trail, 180 plus trail trainings, 165 master plans, 120 bike parks, and more than 21,000 feet of bridge. And we have our member companies have a diverse skill sets, unique to the industry, especially from master planning and design to laying trail out in the field, permit documentation, construction specifications, obviously trail construction, mechanized to hand, bridges and boardwalks, rockwork, rigging, trainings, restoration, reclamation, and specialty trail features. And today we'll be talking about one of these, which is the permitting side of trail projects. And Scott Linenberger will be taking the lead on this webinar. Scott has been in the trail industry since 2002, founded K-Lin in 2009, and has been a member of PTBA since 2011. And I'll hand it over to you, Scott.
Thanks, Erin. Thank you for all showing up. This is a very exciting topic, or it's very obtuse topics sometimes. Navigating NEPA. We're going to talk today about first, what is NEPA? Where did it come from, and what's it supposed to do? Then we'll get into, this is a federal program, so it's going to be full of acronyms, and acronyms can be confusing at times. So we're going to talk about what those acronyms are and what they mean. And each of those acronyms just refers to a required level of review and decision making in the NEPA process. After that, we'll get into navigating the process and focus on the Trails world, and then finally get into some project examples that have gone through this or have changed in the way that NEPA thinks about some of these trail and recreation projects, and have time left over for answering some questions at the end. So first of all, NEPA stands for the Environmental Policy Act. This was a law established in 1970 by President Nixon at the time. It was created in 1969 by Congress, and it was the country's first environmental policy, providing a process to implement it. After, this was driven by the public wanting to know why and how decisions are made, and it applies to all federal agencies. The link there, Citizen's Guide to NEPA, comes from the Council of Environmental Quality, CEQ, which is a nonpartisan entity that is present to help guide the administration in terms of how NEPA is used. So CEQ tries to make sure that NEPA is not a static thing and it only looks at things as if we were still in 1970, but broadly keeps the flavor and nature of NEPA intact. So to begin with, NEPA is an environmental review process, and that review process is there to help make good decisions. It's to help clarify why, what kind of impacts those decisions are made when a change is made to how a federal agency, any federal agency, manages its land. And it informs the public of what that decision making was and how it was made. So why did we develop this kind of policy, or why was this policy really desired by the public? Aaron, if you'd go back one, please. There's lots of decisions made at all times by many federal agencies, and having overarching guidance that's going to be consistent is a necessary thing, as the public felt that many of these decisions in different agencies and in different places were potentially not being made in a consistent basis. And certainly that's a hard thing with the size of a federal government as we have. Also, those decisions were being made by different agencies and different individuals in those agencies. And, this came in a time and on the back of some, really relatively nasty environmental issues that were driven by some bad actors or lack of oversight and a lack of transparency. And the public demanded that they have more knowledge about how those decisions are being made. So in its most basic form, as an environmental review process, the NEPA directs any proposed action that would be a major change by an agency through this kind of a flow chart, where a no refers you to a next box in a flow chart, while a yes takes you someplace else. And these refer to the level of review that any kind of a change would be made, and kind of directs the process of going through that change and what the level of review is. So the levels of review in the NEPA process include the CE, the EA, and the EIS. The CE stands for a categorical exclusion. And these are, typically predetermined actions that are not likely or are likely to not have significant impacts on the social, economic, and environmental status of the situation with the agency. There are many ways to cross this stream. And thinking about these levels of review in NEPA is kind of like that. Each is context sensitive, and it depends on the situation that's at hand. If we're thinking about a trail and crossing the stream, there's many ways to cross a stream, and there are many different types of stream. We could have ephemeral streams or intermittent streams or perennial streams. They all might affect, what kind of action we take in creating that crossing. When we have perennially flowing streams, we have different sorts of perennially flowing streams. We have streams with relatively low flow. We have streams with rivers with relatively high flow, and we have everything in between. Those streams may have sensitive species in them, or they may be pollution impacted, which helps determine, all these things help determine what we might need to do to cross this stream, and to do it in the best way. So if we can determine that it's not going to have much of an impact across the stream, an action like that would be easily assessed and potentially predetermined not to have much impact, and there would be an action associated with that. On the other hand, if we were to plan to cross this stream that has sensitive species or other issues that make the stream of high importance, we might have to go into an environmental assessment process, which is a deeper level of analysis to determine whether the way that we would cross it, or the potential ways that we would cross it, could have impacts on that stream. And if we were crossing that stream and we got to the analysis level where we know that there will be significant impacts no matter what way we cross that stream, that will push us into a much more detailed environmental impact statement process. So with the deeper public analysis or deeper analysis and public engagement required. So we can think of, thinking back to the flow chart on the first page, a categorical exclusion is a relatively easy decision to make. The public still has to be informed of that decision. Whereas an environmental assessment comes in when we know that there may be issues out there that we have to analyze and address. Whereas an environmental impact statement, the kind of third column on that flow chart, is when we know we have a very serious decision to be made that will have significant impacts, both potentially positive and negative. So starting in, thinking about when you have the ability to make a decision about a proposed action with a categorical exclusion, each agency, whether it's the Forest Service or the Park Service or BLM and all the other federal agencies, have determined categories of action that don't have significant effects. Within the case of the Forest Service, an example of a categorical exclusion would be the reconstruction and maintenance of trails. And then that categorical exclusion has a citation on it where it sits in the Federal Register, that 36 CFR 220.6 E1, tells folks with the Forest Service that if they're out maintaining trails, they don't need to go through a formal process to do that. If they're going through a proposed change that fits one of these categorical exclusions, or that the Forest Service has determined not to have significant effects, then the end result is the Forest Service writing a decision memo explaining that action. There is a caveat to this, and that is if what would be thought of as a categorical exclusion ready project may have extraordinary circumstances. And that's a bit of a loaded term, but what it essentially means is we might think that doing maintenance on this trail will not have significant effects or impacts to the environment. But since we've made that decision, we have found that there may be endangered species on or near this trail. There have been cultural resources found in or near the trail, or there's a wetland or other protected kind of area possible. then we would switch and not be able to make that decision with a categorical exclusion, and would then have to move on through an environmental assessment. And we'll talk about these later. So if we believe that there may be significant potential impacts to the environment, to people, or to economies, then we start this environmental assessment process. And that involves developing a purpose and need for our proposed action, and then moving through a course of alternatives. So with a proposed action, we're going to propose in the photo here, we propose to cross this wetland with a trail. And in stating that purpose and need, we'll need to determine, do we actually need to cross this wetland? And we'll have to be able to state, why do we need to cross this wetland? When we get into developing alternatives, one alternative that is required in the process is a no action alternative. So that will be one of the alternatives that we have to consider, which would be, what if we do nothing? If there's a trail through this area and we're not going to do anything, what are the impacts of that? Is there a problem? Is that become problematic? So we have to be able to define, is this a high quality wetland where impacts of that trail and folks using it would decrease the quality of the wetland or harms sensitive species that are in it? Or is it a low quality wetland where we would be stating that, having this trail through it may be, it might be a wet foot experience for folks, but if this wetland is of very low quality, or there's huge amounts of these types of areas in this wetlands in this particular area with trails through them, what are the impacts associated with this one crossing relative to all of them? And then we go into other alternatives. We want to define what are feasible options in crossing this wetland. Are there possible relocations around the wetland so that we wouldn't have to cross it at all? If we are relocating the trail outside and around the wetland, what are the impacts there? And are they greater or less than if we are crossing the wetland? There may be very sensitive species right outside the wetland, or a situation where there is no crossing that's feasible outside of the wetland. And we want to talk about, also this, when we're trying to define the impacts of this proposed action and the alternatives, we're not just talking about things that are negative, we're talking about things that are positive. In a case like this, there may be positive benefits to putting a boardwalk across this wetland, of environmental education, potential interpretation of why we're protecting the wetland in the first place, and why we're making a decision to put this boardwalk in. At this point in the process, after we've developed ideas about what the alternatives could be for this situation, we need to get to a resource review, an on-the-ground analysis. And these are folks, specialists in each agency typically, that go out and try to define the impacts of those different alternatives that have been listed. Part of that process is working with the lead agency in the NEPA process to, reach out to other agencies and or personnel and the public, to let folks know who has been consulted, and how their information has been taken into the decision-making process. At the end of that process, a decision maker, makes the choice of what alternative will be taken, whether it's a no action or one of the other alternatives that are there, and determine at that point their decision making is a finding of no significant impact, that these impacts have been minimized to the greatest extent possible by looking at the different alternatives, and the impacts are not significant. And that FONSI, FONSI, is the chosen alternative and justified reasons for the decision. It's important to note that a FONSI does not have to be the most environmentally sensitive alternative. They're human and economic impacts all come into play. And it's a balancing act of, what's going to be the best alternative for any one project. And letting folks know in that FONSI decision who has been contacted and how the decision was made regarding potential impacts that were there of that proposed action. If there were, or we know that there will be considerable or unavoidable impacts, no matter what alternative was chosen, then we enter into a much more detailed level of analysis with an environmental impact statement. What's important to note here is that going into this environmental impact statement review process is not based on the size of the project, but based on the potential impacts or the magnitude of change in the management decision and the effects on the public. In that kind of a situation, it starts out as not as much of an internal process of looking at alternatives, but of letting the public know what's being planned and going through that rather intense analysis and developing a draft environmental impact statement. And then releasing that statement out for public comment, which is quite extensive and takes quite a bit of time. Before developing, what that final environmental impact statement will be, listing what we know will be significant impacts and what will be done to mitigate those impacts, but how those decisions came about in a transparent manner. And, that is all written out with a record of decision. And, an environmental impact statement is not something that we see in the trails and recreation world very often. Where we did see some environmental impact statements relative to trails and recreational access was a decade or more ago when land managing agencies were directed to go through a travel management process of looking at motorized routes across their lands and figuring out which were needed and which were not needed, which had significant environmental impacts, and what was the level of motorized service needed around those landscapes. That resulted in untold thousands of miles of motorized recreational access being removed from federal lands, which was considered to be a very significant change in terms of the management of those lands and the public's access to those lands. And environmental impact statements were very common after that process, talking about what the new access would be, what types of vehicles, whether it's a full-size vehicle, a plated vehicle, an OHV, would be able to access each of those routes. And so understanding then what these three different levels of review are, we want to figure out how to navigate that process. And that process is a planning process. The NEPA policy dictates what is a very standard type of planning process. And so the way that we want to go as especially private citizens or trail support groups or organizations that are wading into this process on federal lands is that we need to have a plan, and the agency has to have a plan. That's what goes into developing those alternatives. So whether we're looking at a plan that's coming from an agency or from the public, we need to first think about feasibility. Is a trail or trail system possible? What might be the hurdles? And what are the general costs involved? Having a handle on that rather than going to our agency and saying, this is what we want, is the first step in kind of troubleshooting the idea and the proposed action. Second, we need to go through a good planning stage. What kind of trail or trail system do we want? We meaning the public and the agency. How can that be developed and at what cost? Being able to detail those things starts to refine, what is the proposed action that we're looking at. So if we're looking at that at proposed action as a new trail system or a retrofitted trail system, an expanded trail system, it needs to start to look at, what are the problems that we're trying to address, and or what are the benefits that we're receiving by proposing this action. At that same time, we start thinking about and defining, what are the potential impacts that may occur with this new trail system or different trail system, and how are they resolved? How are we going to mitigate the issues that are out there? And also thinking about what other regulatory vehicles, what other environmental protection acts, rather than a policy act like this, are we going to have to deal with? Will we have to deal with the Endangered Species Act? Will we have to deal with the Corps of Engineers and wetlands? Are we dealing in this area with sensitive cultural sites and thinking about how our trail system will avoid these things or how the impacts could be mitigated? And then we're thinking about design. Where would the trails be built and what will be involved in building those trails? This goes back to the alternatives that will have to be developed and what the impacts would be relative to that design. And finally, implementation. How will the project be implemented? How will it be funded? What would be the development timeline? And until we get to being able to answer lots of these questions, it's going to be very difficult to go into the NEPA process with confidence that we're going to come through it with a good decision. So elements of successful projects in moving through NEPA process typically involve coalition. Who is involved? The federal agency will have to describe who's been involved. If it's a proposal coming from the public, who has been involved and how they come up with this proposed idea. And maybe more importantly, defining who has not yet been involved. And hopefully that means not yet been involved, because going down through a NEPA process without having talked with folks who use that land, whether that's an agency use or whether that's a private use, getting everyone informed before we start the process is going to always resolve itself in more successful projects. Starting discussion with an agency on whose land the project is going to take shape, starting that discussion early is really vital. Proposed action and a change in action, all changes are hard. And especially when we're working in situations where agencies and the folks that work in them are, I will say, generally to quite often overworked. Adding something to a plate requires time and deliberation. And so making demands is not the way to get through a process very well. And understanding that proposing an idea takes time to get through an agency. Agencies have different departments, and an idea should go through a lot of those departments to develop, its idea and relevance, and whether that's a project to move forward. Every successful project has champions. And for those of us who work in the trail world with federal agencies, most of the time we're working with field-based staff or line officers, folks in the recreation department that are in charge of that department. These are not folks that have decision-making authority on proposed actions. The decision-making authority in agencies comes from a level higher up than that. If we're working in the National Forest, decisions are made by the forest supervisor or the district ranger. Similarly with the BLM and the Park Service, the folks that are going to initiate the NEPA process are those folks that make the decisions. And so this is part of the early agency discussion, in that we want to be speaking with people who make the decisions rather than the folks that are in the field that see things like we will be working with them on stewardship, trail building, and other things, but they're not the decision makers of authority. We also need champions from outside. external leaders, whoever's championing this from outside the agency, they really have to be consistently present, supportive of the process, and then communicate back to that larger coalition that's been involved in the process to start. An agency really does not do well having to answer questions from 12 different people about one project. Having a single point of contact and somebody who is consistent and supportive of the project is the vital one person to be that narrow part of the funnel in having those discussions. And then folks need to show up. Public engagement is vital, and it's a prescribed part of the process, whether it's an EA or an EIS, something that isn't simple. Public engagement is necessary, and that consistency with engaging in the process is key to developing a successful project. And being responsive when hurdles are encountered, because hurdles will always be encountered in a process, and being flexible and creative are vital both for the agency and for the public that's interested in this process. And as part of that, with the public comment, this is public comments and public engagement are a form of assistance in helping, promote informed decision-making about the proposed action. When public comments are made, we need to make them in sufficient detail to understand the issues that have been raised. And these comments should be clear, they should be concise, they should be relevant. They should be polite, respectful, and solutions-oriented. These are the types of comments that gain the most traction in a process and move a decision positively down the road. Understanding, though, that a comment is not a vote. An agency is not going to look at 100 comments and tally them up and say there was 75 comments for this process or for this proposed action and 25 against. And so the proposed folks that think that the project should move forward are going to get their way. The agency is going to have to make a decision based on all relevant information and the analysis of the potential impacts that are there. Good process, good public comments, start early, just like the early agency discussion. Being involved early is the best way to be a part of the process moving through. Because at the end of the process, there are the potential for appeals and legal remedies, such as lawsuits, that are out there if the public doesn't think that the agency made the correct decision. And that potential right there can be a huge anti-motivator for any agency to go through the NEPA process. Thinking that there might not be good support, thinking that the public will not provide those, in early involvement and a level of assistance and commenting that are positive is kind of a dead end that agencies can look at, understanding that in these processes, there's lots of stones that need to be turned over. And, most are inconsequential, but some are not. And we need to look under all of them in any case, and then address them in the decision memo or the FONSI or the record of decision. So some examples of processes. The CEQ, Council of Environmental Quality, worked with the Biden administration to try to do some regulatory streamlining of the NEPA process. And to, they at times look at, what are the previous categorical exclusions that have been developed and what might be future categorical exclusions that could be developed based on past actions that, something went through an EA or an EIS, typically an EA, and it's been analyzed and found that it should be suitable for a categorical exclusion. And in the future, that these types of actions can go through that categorical exclusion process. So the link up at the top gets you to, I just picked one agency, with the Forest Service being that agency, and what revisions were brought to the NEPA process in terms of categorical exclusions. And off of that link, there's a number of different links that take you to all the different projects that were analyzed and how they came to the conclusions of adding some of these projects to a categorical exclusion level. So some examples of those. The Cave Run non-motorized trail project looked at a large trail system where there were lots of user conflicts between equestrian users, hiking users, and mountain bike users. And the EA that the agency went through decided that the only way to really dissolve this use conflict and the conditions on the ground was to split the trail system up so that equestrians had one trail system that they shared access with hikers. Mountain bikers had a different trail system that they shared with hikers, and there were some trails that were now managed for hiking only. So that environmental analysis went through, what the change of that proposed action would incur. And looking back at it, as folks analyzed it, they stated the Forest Service was able to state that, it wasn't really a large change that would increase or change the impacts on the ground, environmental, access, or otherwise. Both mountain biking and equestrian, and also obviously pedestrian user groups, still had large trail systems to utilize. And so this was a management change that could have been made without going through an environmental assessment process. These next couple, the Buford-Newcastle ATV and side-by-side trail and the Rim Butte Jeep OHV trail projects, these looked at redeveloping experiences that were lost through, but noted during the travel management planning process. So during that process, folks came out and were involved in that travel management process and said, when you close these trails, then we're going to lose these types of experiences. And we would like to get those types of experiences back in the future. And it was noted that this would not need to go through this type of process would not need to go through an EA in the future, because it was noted during the travel management planning process and analyzed at that time. It just hadn't been implemented at that point. So it would still go through resource review on the ground of where those new routes would be that are added later, but it wouldn't, and the trails might need to get moved around because of that. But the idea that that was a major change was something that had already been decided, that some of these experiences would likely come back after the travel management plan process was implemented. Telephone Canyon Trails project outside of Las Vegas, went through an EIS to look at lots of things from unauthorized routes to diversifying recreational experiences that were desired by an increasing population in that area, and made some decisions on adding new trails. But some of those decisions couldn't be made because of very short flowering times for species that they had to look at in terms of new route development. And so those were put on hold, but were mentioned that new routes would be developed in the future. When they could go through that resource clearance to look at those routes, they'd made the decision that, that didn't really need to go through an EA because it was already listed in the previous EIS. And similarly, with the Turkey Springs Trail Management Plan, this had gone through a broad overarching plan to alter the trail system in order to reduce resource impacts and improve recreation access and quality. So doing that, this analysis, looking back on that project, stated that, what we're doing more of is reconstruction of trails, reducing impacts, and we have this broad overarching plan to do that. What we need to do is, when we get to the point of putting some of those trails on the ground, we need to go through resource review and make sure that we aren't impacting any resources, but that could go through, because it was already part of a management plan, that could go through a categorical exclusion process instead of a full scope EA. And similarly with the Phil's Trailhead project, in a growing area around Bend, Oregon, with a growing mountain bike population there, the Forest Service started to see that roads were being clogged, access was being limited by the lack of trailhead and parking infrastructure, and those were creating other issues. And that rather than having to go through a full EA to create a trailhead and a few new trails that came out of that trailhead, that what they were doing was more so reducing those impacts and keeping those roads open, and then it didn't need to go through a full EA process to put that trailhead on the ground. Some project examples where it hasn't been always granted a CE, but the public has provided not only comment, but leadership and a lot of assistance, and other projects that have gone through that type of long-term planning. One project, Bailey's Trail System, a CE, a categorical exclusion, was granted with a decision memo for an 86-mile new trail system. That seems like a very large project for what you would consider a minor impact and a categorical exclusion. But the way that the project was developed, it was basically developed by the public and partners through the EA process, but EA was not run through the Forest Service. So the Forest Service District Ranger was able to say at the end of that planning process, where public engagement had occurred, plans had changed, resource review had occurred, and things were looked at, in terms of the overall direction of the area where the project was promoted, which was a recreation managed area that did not yet have recreation in it, other than passive use and hunting. It hadn't been developed because the Forest Service was waiting for a willing partner to help create and steward that trail system. And when they found that steward, and the organization helped go through that, basically an EA process, the forest was able to say that, we've figured out what impacts would be here and mitigated those, and so we can grant a CE for this project. A different kind of project where the public assisted were the trails at Jake's Rocks, where a FONSI was granted after an EA, but the Forest Service did very little in developing that EA other than place the documentation into their template. The resource review was completed by trained college interns, so that the Forest Service didn't have to allocate staff time for those biological and cultural reviews. And the Forest Service was confident in going through with this proposed action because the implementation, the trail building itself, and then the stewardship and management of that trail system was committed to by an external partner. So that made the forest in that situation feel very comfortable going through this trail development process, because it wasn't adding to their burden of trail management. That was being done by a partner. From fundraising to construction and construction management, and then ongoing stewardship. Another project in the Daniel Boone National Forest, a large-scale trail assessment and long-term management plan has been developed that focuses on looking at the forest plan and the resource issues that the forest is trying to manage, and looking at where trails and trail systems intersect with those resource issues, such as water quality and riparian habitat, and mitigating the issues that the trail system currently has, responding to changing recreation desires, and placing the forest in a place where it's consistent with acting in consistency with its forest plan, and then bolstered by some other system trail management decisions that particular forest has made that would then fit into how they enact this plan. Finally, a different kind of project, but similar in a long-term planning, the Trails at Mena project became a programmatic EA, stating that this is not the exact location that these new trails will be, but as a large-scale project, this area, which we have already stated will be managed for recreation, and will be issued a special use permit to an external entity to allow the development of essentially a ski area that is mountain bike focused and open for 4 seasons, with potentially shuttle service to get folks from the bottom of the top, or ski lifts that would do the same thing. And that would be managed under a special use permit to an external entity. And that programmatic EA goes through the process of stating, what those impacts might be, what the positive benefits would be for local and regional economies, and for access to the forest where there was limited recreational access before in an area that had been projected for recreation management. So frequently asked questions, things that I thought might come up. Does an agency have to complete all the NEPA documentation? And that answer is no. And where the public can help, or the public can raise funds to provide, work for private specialists to do that work, really helps projects move in a direction where we're not trying to steal from already overcommitted staff time. This overcommitted staff and the fact that folks are doing their job on a daily basis and adding a new project onto their docket becomes challenging and problematic is something that a decision maker, looking at their staff and their workload, they have to have a balancing act as to how much they burden their staff with additional kind of work. An agency can accept work from external professionals who are working in close collaboration with that agency throughout the whole process. How long does an EA take to complete? CEQ guidance states that from inception of saying we're going to analyze this potential project, it should be completed within 1 year, unless it's otherwise stated or something significantly goes on along the way, as might push us into an environmental impact statement process. What is compliance with NEPA decisions? When the decision is made, whether it's in a decision memo or a FONSI or a record of decision, it will state in that decision, the guidance from the agency as to how the project will move on from there with respect to that particular project and with respect to other federal regulations if they're encountered during that implementation process or the management into the future. And finally, what is the best way to get trail projects going positively down the NEPA process? When the public and the agency can get together and look at ways to solve existing problems and improve future conditions. If folks can get on that same page, the NEPA process is not real onerous, but it's usually, demands and or limited ideas that keep projects from moving forward. And I think we have about 10 minutes left for questions.
All right. Well, we have quite a few questions that have come up, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. One question, Scott, was about, in terms of who is the decision maker, in terms of looking at the potential effect versus potential significant effect, in terms the process, who decides?
Well, the decision maker is going to be, in the case of the U.S. Forest Service, the district ranger. That district ranger will depend on their resource staff to look at the project with them and determine the significance of the potential impacts of that proposed action. So they'll do that work on the ground and based on their knowledge of the resources that are out there and the proposed or the action that's being proposed. And they'll work through that process with the district ranger. At the BLM, it's a very similar process. except, the titles have changed. Often we work with folks at the field level in the trails world, and understanding that, that person that we work with on, trail maintenance work is not the decision maker in these projects. They're a partner of ours, but more broadly, the partner needs to be that forest district.
There's another question about, are you limited to using the categorical exclusion list only for the agency that is funding your project?
That is a tricky one. With this streamlining of the NEPA process, there's a statement in there that was made that categorical exclusions from other agencies may be utilized if they are pertinent to the project that's being proposed. That is obviously not they may be utilized. That is not a hard and fast rule. And that's a decision that decision maker would have to make. Certainly one that, the public can bring to bear with that decision maker and agency. And it may be the right fit for that project. If that decision maker decides that that's not the right fit, they have the ability to state that, we're going to stick with our own agency's CEs exclusively.
There's a question, are there estimates for how much it costs, not including the trail project design and construction, to have a project go through the NEPA process?
That's a difficult one. It's all about the scale and size of the project. And obviously, the larger the project, the more analysis on the ground that's going to have to be. If we're looking at, say, one major bridge crossing where there hasn't been a bridge before, and so that would provide access from one side of a river to another side of the river, and we're considering what the impacts of now providing access to the other side of the river would be, both positive and negative. We're looking at one location, a river crossing, and then kind of a general idea of how we, use that bridge to get to trails on the other side. If we're looking at, say, a 40-mile trail system, we're not looking at one distinct location on the ground. So there's going to have to be, quite a bit more resource review to that, and potentially other things that come into play from an alternative standpoint.
So there's a lot of questions about if you are hearing, foresee, kind of like what's your insight in terms of changes to NEPA based on staffing or other changes related to the current administration?
I would say, in short, that federal agencies have been struggling to maintain their trail systems for well over a decade now. When a GAO report came out 15 or so years ago that stated that the majority of trails on federal lands did not meet the maintenance level that they needed to meet, that put that situation, out there and very visible. The situation has not improved since then. Every agency needs more volunteers, more stewards, and they're not likely to get, as we've seen of late, a lot more staff. In fact, they may be reducing staff, and most of the staff reductions that, I think that we could see recently are folks that are, doing things on the ground, getting that trail work done. So looking into the future, the more the public can help any agency get through and have a streamlined, positive NEPA process, the more potential that project has for being implemented on the ground and being successful.
There's a question about what is the statute of limitations or length of time that a historical route can be grandfathered in and not require NEPA?
That's another challenging question. A trail system is looked at, in the NEPA process from the standpoint of potential impacts that it has. I have worked on trail systems where the trails were there prior to NEPA being around. The trails were there before 1970, which means that the trail systems that they have likely never went through any kind of formal resource review, biological, cultural, etc. And now thinking about what to do with that trail at this point, and does it trigger a NEPA process to do anything with that trail, is a decision that's going to be made, in the Forest Service at that district level, as to, can we reasonably state that, this historic route is part of our trail system, or do we need to analyze what formalizing that route would mean in terms of our recreation providing?
There's some questions in terms of about the process and like looking at the benefits and the, opportunity lost. So one question is, can the no alternative scenario consider the lost opportunity or benefits of not doing the project?
Yes. And that should be part of, what we are talking about is not just environmental impacts, but social and economic impacts. So doing nothing certainly may have, negative impacts, as it could have positive impacts. So looking at no action is still an analysis. It's part of the analysis tool, but it's just prescribed to state that, if we retain the status quo, what would that mean in terms of, how we're managing this land for the public?
All right. There's another question about kind of the intersection of state agencies and federal agencies. And this example is specific to Colorado, but the question is kind of, have you seen this around the country? So during the most recent process on a local trail network on Forest Service land, the Colorado DNR made it a condition for their approval of the Forest Service NEPA for Forest Service and Colorado Parks and Wildlife to create an additional adaptive management plan that broke the project down into phases and gave CPW/DNR more control over the progression of implementation all the way. So there's the setup, but do you see this happening in other states as well? For example, the demonstration of state authority to give ultimate yes or no over Forest Service decision-making authority on its own.
Every federal land agency makes decisions as to how they will manage their land. That's stated. There are lots of projects and there are lots of resources that are co-managed. In the case of the question that you asked, Colorado Parks and Wildlife is ultimately responsible for maintaining and protecting wildlife and wildlife habitat. A lot of that habitat is on federal land. Some of that habitat is on state land. That habitat is on private land. But that is their mission. In lots of NEPA processes, there are going to be multiple stakeholders with, a right and a responsibility to be part of that process. Lots of recreation projects, run from state or local land onto federal land. And that means that multiple agencies will be involved in that process. NEPA prescribes that, one agency will become the lead agency in that process. Typically, that's the federal agency, but there's also times when multiple federal agencies are involved in a singular project. And at that point, one of the agencies has to take the lead and become that lead agency. So there are, in terms of that analysis, that is part of the give and take with multiple stakeholders, including the public, into how that management action, if it is approved, how it's going to be implemented over time.
Thanks. I think that's all we have time for in terms of questions, and I'll hand it over to Candace.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Scott. Really appreciate the thorough presentation. I know we got a lot of questions that came in that we were not able to ask. So, of course, we invite attendees to reach out to the presenter. I'm going to share his email in my follow-up email with all attendees within 2 days. That will also include a link to the recording, the closed caption transcript, and all of the resources that you see here listed on this slide. And all of the resources are also noted on the webinar's webpage for future reference. So along with the Professional Trail Builders Association, we also want to thank the additional webinar partners that include iZone Imaging, the Grisberger Fund, 5280 Creative, the Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service, and the USDA Forest Service. And we hope you'll join us for our next webinar in the Advancing Trails webinar series. And a reminder to subscribe and support American Trails on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/American Trails, where all of our webinar recordings are housed. So thank you again to everyone for attending. I hope you all enjoy the rest